In 2012, inside the British Museum, scientists aimed multispectral light at a 400-year-old map of Virginia, John White's 1585 map, coastline, rivers, native towns. At one inland river junction, the surface changed. A tiny piece of paper had been pasted over the map. Then the light crossed the patch. Under it, researchers reported red and blue marks, fort-like, but still interpreted evidence, not a solved case. That matters because the famous Roanoke clue was out in the open. Croatoan carved into wood at an empty settlement. The map clue was quieter. It sat under paper, inside the document White left behind. For the roughly 115 colonists, this does not give us a final fate. It gives the search a second direction. Maybe the Roanoke mystery was never only about vanishing. Maybe it was about movement that English records failed to follow. To understand why that covered mark matters, go to what White expected to read when he reached Roanoke in 1590. 3 years earlier, in 1587, White had left more than 100 colonists on Roanoke Island and sailed back to England for supplies. When he came back, the settlement was not a battlefield. The houses had been taken down. A new palisade enclosed the area, and on the wood his men found a message in capital letters, Croatoan. Later, that word became a horror symbol. To White, it was information. Croatoan referred to a known place and people to the south, around what is now Hatteras Island. Then there was the missing mark. White had agreed with the colonists that if they were forced away under attack or extreme danger, they would carve a Maltese cross as a distress sign. In his account, there was no cross. So the evidence does not begin with people evaporating. It begins with an empty site, a carved place name, and no agreed signal of emergency. The sharper question is whether the colony moved together, split into groups, or left traces we have only partly learned how to read. White wanted to follow the clue, but the Atlantic had already stolen 3 years from him. That delay came from war, weather, ships, and supply lines stretched between English ports and Spanish waters. Roanoke makes more sense when the map pulls back from the island to the war zone around it. In the late 1500s, this coast was not an empty edge of the world waiting for English settlers. It sat inside a contest between empires. Spain held power across much of the Caribbean, Mexico, and Florida. Its treasure fleets crossed the Atlantic, and Spanish officials watched for English privateers, scouts, and settlements that could become bases for raids. To England, Roanoke was a foothold. To Spain, an English colony in that zone was not harmless. Spanish records show real concern about English activity and efforts to locate the settlement. That is not proof of a Spanish attack. The practical point is that everyone understood the location of an English outpost could be dangerous information. Then, in 1588, the wider war hit the supply line. The Spanish Armada sailed against England. English ships, crews, money, and attention were pulled into defense and privateering. White had gone home in 1587, intending to gather supplies and return quickly, but the route back became hostage to war, weather, ship availability, and men who cared more about Spain than about a small colony across the sea. By the time White reached Roanoke in 1590, the delay was nearly 3 years, so White did not return to a simple mystery. Roanoke was not a sealed room with 115 people inside it. It was a fragile settlement at the end of a broken Atlantic lifeline, exposed to hunger, diplomacy, rivalry, and rumor. In that world, a carved destination mattered, a missing distress cross mattered, and a hidden mark on a map could matter too, because survival may have depended on who knew where you had gone. The people inside that exposed settlement were not simply soldiers waiting behind a wall. They were a small civilian colony of roughly 115 people, including families, artisans, laborers, and officials, trying to make an English foothold permanent before its support system failed. Picture the problem at ground level. A storehouse gets checked. A boat is inspected. Tools have to be kept dry. Someone has to decide whether the next conversation with a nearby community will bring food, warning, or conflict. Roanoke Island sat inside a living native world, with communities that had their own alliances, rivalries, losses, and memories of earlier English contact. Some relationships were already damaged before the 1587 settlers arrived. Others, especially with the Croatoan people connected to Manteo, offered possible communication and refuge. Survival was about diplomacy as much as food. As months stretched toward years, staying put may have become the least rational option. A settlement that depends on ships cannot behave as if ships are guaranteed. Low stores, damaged relations, disease, and weather would not need to produce one sudden catastrophe. They could push people toward smaller decisions, made again and again. One path led toward a known ally. Another could follow waterways inland, where river travel, food, trade, and distance from the exposed coast may have mattered. A group under pressure might move together, or send some people ahead, while others held the old site. So when White found no bodies, no battle scene, and no agreed distress mark, the emptiness should not be treated as the whole story. The colony may have become invisible to English eyes because it had adapted to a landscape England did not control. The coastal route begins with the clue almost everyone knows. Stripped of legend, it looks less like a symbol and more like a message left for John White. White recorded finding 3 letters, CRO, carved into a tree near the landing place. At the abandoned settlement, he found the fuller word cut into a palisade post, Croatoan. Not written in blood, not left as a curse, carved into wood. To White, that word had meaning. Croatoan was the name of a place and people south of Roanoke, associated with what is now Hatteras Island. The English already knew that world through earlier contact, especially through Manteo, the native leader who had traveled to England and remained one of the colony's most important local allies. If the settlers had moved there, the carving was a destination marker placed where White would see it. The next detail shaped how White read the entire scene. Before White left for England, he and the colonists had agreed on a signal. If they were forced to leave in danger, they were supposed to carve a cross above the message. White looked for that sign. He did not find it. That absence does not prove the settlers were safe. It does not prove they all reached Croatoan, stayed there, or survived. But it shows how White read the scene, not as the aftermath of an obvious attack, but as evidence that the colony had departed without the agreed distress mark. The tragedy is that he could not follow the clue. His ships were battered, supplies were limited, and Outer Banks weather was turning dangerous. Attempts to continue the search were cut short, and White was forced away before he could inspect Croatoan Island himself. Croatoan points toward one possible refuge, but it does not close the case. It may describe one group's path, one stage in a longer movement, or a message left by people who expected White to understand more than we do. Croatoan points east. On John White's own map, another possible direction had been physically covered. The map is called La Virginea Pars. White made it after the earlier Roanoke voyages, and for centuries it looked like a detailed survey of the Carolina sounds, rivers, and native towns known to the English. Then researchers noticed the interruption itself. Near a river confluence inland, a small patch of paper lay over the drawn surface. The physical fact is the patch. Its placement, over that spot on the map, is what made researchers look closer. In 2012, the British Museum examined the map with multispectral imaging, using different wavelengths of light to read what ordinary sight could not. Under the paper, they reported a red and blue mark shaped like a small fort or enclosed settlement. The hidden symbol does not sit on Roanoke Island. It does not point toward Hatteras. It appears roughly 50 miles inland, in the region of modern Bertie County, near major waterways connected to the Chowan and Roanoke river systems. The area later nicknamed Site X by researchers. On a survival map, that matters. Rivers were roads. A confluence could mean movement, food, trade, and contact with native communities away from the exposed barrier islands. For settlers cut off from England and vulnerable on the coast, an inland fallback would have been practical. The scan can show the covered mark. It cannot tell us why the paper went there. Correction, security from Spanish eyes, or a contingency site are interpretations researchers have to weigh against the map, the war, and later evidence. Now the evidence forms two routes. one carved openly in wood toward Croatoan, another covered on the map and pointing inland. If that second route was meaningful, the next question is what archaeologists found in the soil near that target. A map can point. The ground has to answer. At the inland area researchers call Site X, the first colony foundation excavated along the region suggested by the patched map. What they reported finding was not a buried English village, and not a sign with a name on it. It was smaller, fragments of Elizabethan borderware, a coarse, everyday pottery associated with late 16th century England. That kind of object matters because it is ordinary. Borderware was not ceremonial treasure. It was used for cooking, storage, and daily life, the kind of thing that breaks, gets discarded, and disappears into soil while people are trying to live somewhere. A shard does not tell us who held the pot, but it can tell us English material culture reached a place the map had already made important. This is where the evidence becomes more interesting and also more limited. Pottery cannot identify all 115 colonists. It cannot place Virginia Dare at Site X. It cannot prove the entire Roanoke settlement packed up, marched inland, and stayed there as one group. Archaeology rarely gives that kind of clean sentence. What it can do is narrow the field. A hidden fort-like symbol under White's patch points inland. Excavations in that broader inland target area produced Elizabethan English pottery. Together, those facts make an inland English presence harder to dismiss than it was before the map was scanned. That changes the shape of the mystery. Croatoan still points toward the coastal world of the Croatoan people, around present-day Hatteras. Site X points toward river country inland. For a colony under pressure, splitting was not failure by definition. It could have been a survival plan, some people toward known coastal allies, others toward a more protected inland network of rivers, food, and trade. The strongest picture is not a single dramatic disappearance. It is a scattered human decision, traced in wood, paper, and broken pottery. White left with the search unfinished, and the records after him do not fill the space he left behind. Weather, damaged anchors, nervous crews, and Atlantic sailing pulled him away before he could follow Croatoan to Hatteras or test any inland route. After that, the archive thins. A few reports, later rumors, colonial hearsay, and fragments copied, retold, or interpreted long after the people themselves were gone from English view. When the record goes quiet, people supply the missing ending. In the 20th century, the Dare stones seemed to do exactly that. Carved messages, supposedly from Eleanor Dare, describing death, movement, and tragedy after the colony left Roanoke. They were dramatic, personal, almost too complete. Most are now widely regarded as hoaxes. The first stone has been debated more cautiously, but it still does not carry the evidentiary weight of a contemporary record, an excavated context, or a known artifact chain. The Spanish massacre theory begins with a real pressure. Spain did see English colonies as threats. Spanish officials searched for the English foothold on the coast. But surviving records do not confirm that they found Roanoke, destroyed it, or captured the settlers. A plausible fear is not the same as evidence of an event, so the stronger stack is smaller and more physical. Croatoan remains because White saw it carved in wood and because it matched a known place and people. The map patch remains because multispectral imaging revealed a hidden fort-like symbol at an inland river confluence. The pottery remains because Elizabethan borderware came out of the ground in the broader area that symbol points toward. Other claims show how the story kept spreading. These three clues show why the investigation changed. With the false leads stripped away, the remaining picture is quieter, but better supported. White found Croatoan carved in wood, with no agreed sign of distress beside it. That makes movement toward Croatoan a serious possibility for at least some settlers, without proving arrival or survival for everyone. White's map also carried a hidden fort-like mark at an inland river confluence. Its purpose is still open. Correction, secrecy, contingency, or something else. The record shows the covered symbol. The interpretation is that it may preserve an inland option away from the exposed coast. In the broader Site X area, Elizabethan borderware later came out of the ground. That gives the inland hypothesis physical weight, though the pottery cannot name every person who went there. So Roanoke was likely not a single vanishing act. Researchers have to leave room for dispersal. Smaller groups, possible alliances, trade, adaptation, and possible integration into native communities already living and negotiating on this coast. The evidence supports that direction without letting us narrate every life afterward. The map patch does not close the case. It rewrote the question. The better question is no longer, where did they vanish? It is, what happened after they moved? For Roanoke, that may be the most honest answer the evidence gives us. Not disappearance, but survival that became hard to recognize from across an ocean. The past rarely gives us answers. It gives us clues.